In this video, we are going to be running benchmarks and speed tests of Windows versus Linux, including everything from the boot speed tests, file transfer speeds, synthetic benchmarks, graphic tests, and a whole lot more. I've done videos like this with a variety of different machines, but in the 2024 version today, we are going to be using this laptop right here. This is a laptop featuring the Intel N95 processor. The N95 and N100s are basically the replacement to the Intel Celerons. Primarily the reason I chose this device is they are going to eventually be everywhere. And one thing you'll notice, and one thing we've noticed in previous videos, is the better the hardware, the less of an actual difference in the benchmarking. So with this device, we both get modern hardware and actual noticeable differences in some of these tests. Now the hardware is important, but what is most important for this video is the actual software we are going to be testing. And that is going to be Windows. We have Ubuntu 22.04, Fedora 39, and Endeavor OS. I have all the software information here, and there'll be a post down below with much more information if you're interested. Probably the most important thing, both Ubuntu and Fedora are running the stock GNOME environment, and then Endeavor OS is running its stock, which is going to be KDE Plasma, and Endeavor OS is going to be kind of our fill-in for Arch Linux. But before we get on to the testing, I do need to thank the sponsor of this video, Twingate, for making this possible. Twingate makes it really easy to deploy a zero-trust network, so it makes it incredibly simple to connect to your local network from just about anywhere in the world, making it a phenomenal local VPN replacement. Actually, spinning it up is as simple as getting one of their connectors on either a local server, NAS, Raspberry Pi, or really any hardware of your choice. Connecting that up with their online platform, and you're good to go. You can set up various resources. You could add teams of people and give them port-specific access to various services on your network, whether that be a specific file server, various web services, networking tools, DNS, really anything. They even have a really nice mobile app here that you can connect to, and you can use single sign-on in addition to setting up authorization keys for even more security. For personal accounts, it is completely free, up to 5 users. And I'll go ahead and post a link down below. Use that link, it helps out the channel, of course. So for this first group of tests, these are the actual side-by-side speed tests. I ran all these tests basically in the exact same conditions multiple times to make sure there were no big deviations in the scores. And starting with the boot speed test, firing up these machines, starting the clock as soon as my finger releases from the button. The first machine to drop us into the desktop was Ubuntu at 29 seconds. Followed up narrowly by Arch Linux at 30.5 seconds. And then in third place, we actually had Windows at 34.7 seconds. And then finally, Fedora Linux booted up in 35.2 seconds. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably restart your computer more than you shut it down. So I was curious, what can restart quicker? Now, when it comes to the restart speed, it was basically the same order, but there was some key differences. Ubuntu went ahead and restarted in 36.4 seconds, followed up really closely by Arch Linux at 37.9 seconds. And then a few seconds later at 41 seconds, Ubuntu fired up, and then a whole 56.4 seconds is what it took Fedora to do that complete reboot. Now that we're in the system, one of the very first things that I did was update all of the systems to their latest version as of the date of recording. Once completely up to date, I went to see what system was using the most storage, or well, what system was giving me the most available storage usable by me. And in this case, Fedora definitely gave me the most at 504 gigabytes, followed up by Ubuntu at 462 gigabytes. And then we had Windows with 440 gigabytes of usable space. And then, at least in this case, the least available space was Arch Linux at 435 gigabytes. Now, I will note, and you will probably also know, if you install just base Arch Linux and put only the stuff you need on it, it won't be nearly as bloated as an Endeavor OS install, so do take this result with a grain of salt. Next up, we had the file transfer speed test. This right here is the USB device that I used. This one's a little unique. It's USB-C, but it actually has a removable NVMe SSD in here, so pretty cool. On this thing, I just had over 17 gigabytes worth of files to go ahead and transfer. I had all of the open mapping data for Australia, as well as Steamboat Willie, and a folder of one of my favorite TV shows. Now, copy and pasting that to the documents folder was done the quickest in Arch Linux at 47.2 seconds, followed up by Ubuntu at 48.3, and then Fedora at 49.3, and then lastly Windows at 53 seconds to transfer just about 17 gigabytes of files from this device. Now from there, since I transferred over Steamboat Willie and I can actually show it on screen, I decided to render it out in Kdenlive at its default settings. And when performing this test, we actually saw Fedora blow everything out of the water with a result of 1 minute it took to render this out. That was followed up by Arch Linux at 1 minute and 48 seconds, and then Ubuntu at 1 minute and 49 seconds. And then after that, Windows was definitely the slowest at 2 minutes and 20 seconds. So from there, we have some pretty basic app opening tests just to see if there's any significant differences. For some of these, I did lower the speed of the footage to about half speed because they all open up pretty quick. With Firefox launching the quickest on Arch Linux, followed up by Fedora, and then it was nearly tied with Windows and Ubuntu. Next, I opened up another browser, Microsoft Edge, and in this case, it was a little bit more in Windows' favor. Windows and Arch were tied to open up this application, with actually Arch loading the quickest when it comes to the elements on the actual home screen, and then Ubuntu and Fedora are basically on par when it comes to loading those home screen elements. Next up, we have LibreOffice Writer. Now this is going to be a clear Linux win. We had Arch, Fedora, Ubuntu open it up, and it took Windows quite a while to open up. Now, this isn't necessarily the fault of Windows. If we opened up something like Microsoft Word and that filled that, and instead of Writer, it would probably be just as quick. When it comes to applications like LibreOffice Writer, or even like a GIMP is another example, it takes Windows a little bit longer to load all the libraries that the application requires, in which with Linux, they're all on the system and they're much more easy to access. From there, we went ahead and opened up Kdenlive, and this one definitely did open the fastest on Arch Linux, borderline instantaneously, and then Windows and Ubuntu were pretty close, but Fedora did lag slightly behind. So now, the battery test. For this, what I did is I installed Microsoft Edge. For everyone, it's going to be the flat pack. I turned off all of the settings that would dim or shut off the screen, and I full screened it, put the YouTube video in theater mode, set it to 720p. The video I used was the 10-hour loop of Crab Rave. Hooked it up to my capture card and just ran it until it died, making sure that everything at the same brightness level and all that. And in this case, the best battery life was given to Fedora, running 3 hours and 6 minutes on this specific device. That was followed up closely by Arch Linux at 3 hours and 2 minutes, and then that was followed up by Ubuntu at 2 hours and 56 minutes, and then just lagging slightly behind was Windows at 2 hours and 51 minutes. So from there, we are now going to dive into the wonderful world of synthetic benchmarks. These give us a nice score based on a particular test to kind of see some of the differences in our systems. And for our very first test, we ran kind of a generic all-encompassing test. And I will note, most of these tests will be linked down below. This Geekbench one for sure. Geekbench is a all-around performance benchmark that tests both the single-core and multi-core performance. Here we can see all of our results are single and multi-core performance, and we can see across the board the winner of the general performance benchmark is going to be Arch Linux with a multi-core score above 3,000 and a single-core score at 1,268. Ubuntu was followed up really close, just under 3,000 for the multi-core and 1,240 for single. And then we could see here, at least on this general benchmark, Windows did fall in last place at 1,189 for the single-core score and 2,844 for the multi-core score. Now, from there, I did a quick graphical test. I will note, these laptops are not gaming devices. If you try to use them for gaming, you're probably not going to have that great of a time. You might be able to play some retro gaming, some light emulation, but other than that, I wouldn't recommend it. Regardless, I ran UEngine Heaven benchmark set to 720p high, and in this case, this is where we get our first Windows dub. An absolute dub, mind you, with OpenGL performance scored at 577. The next best was Arch Linux at 524, and then Ubuntu barely missed the 500-point mark, and Fedora actually kind of fell behind this at 466. Windows does have DirectX 11. I tested that, and it scored basically on par with their OpenGL score, this one at 575. So now we're probably going to go into one of the very best benchmarking platforms, and that is OpenBenchmark. Granted, it is the best in my opinion, but for some reason, not all my results were successfully uploaded. So they were able to provide some graphs, and I had to make some of my own because it all wasn't uploaded properly. With that said, the very first benchmark we ran was Crafty. This is an open source chess engine helping us measure CPU performance. This is done in nodes per second, and we can see the chart here. In this case, the more is going to be better, and we have Fedora definitely getting more at 7.8 million. Ubuntu and Arch are pretty close, with Arch taking a slight advantage, and then last place we have Windows at 7.1 million nodes per second. From there, we ran a test called C-Ray. This is a simple ray tracer designed to test the floating point CPU performance. And unlike the previous test, this one is measured in seconds, and the fewer, or the shortest amount of time, is going to be a better score. This one was a lot closer, but we did have a clear winner. Ubuntu here scored a 256, while everything else scored a 265, with Windows actually getting just a barely slight advantage over Fedora and Arch Linux. Next, we have a memory test. This is going to be Geekbench. This is designed to test the memory and cache bandwidth performance. And in this test and the next few, we might see some clear Linux advantages. This one is more the better. This is measured in megabytes per second. This is the read-write modify test. And we can see here the winners in reverse order. We have Arch, Fedora, and Ubuntu, all hovering in about 74,000, and then we have Windows behind just under 50,000. Next up is PHP Bench. This is a whole benchmark suite for PHP. This performs a large number of simple tests in order to bench various aspects of the PHP interpreter. This one is another definite Linux advantage, but in this case, there were some big differences between some of the distributions. This one is a score, so the more is better, and the highest scoring one is Ubuntu at 757 or 757,000, followed up by Fedora at 732, Arch at 607, and then Windows at 373. Ultimately, there's a reason why Linux is the preferred platform of most servers in the world. Now let's switch over from PHP to Python. This test reports the average test times for different functions, such as the built-in function calls and nested for loops, with a total result giving you a rough estimate of how a system will perform with Python. This test is in milliseconds, so the fewer the better, and we had an Arch dub. Arch coming in at 904 milliseconds, followed up by Ubuntu, then Fedora, both really close, and then we have Windows at 1,500 milliseconds. So the next test I ran was called T-Test 1. This is a basic memory allocator benchmark. This test is in seconds, so the fewer the better, and the best performer was Ubuntu, followed up by Fedora, and then closely behind that was Arch, and then finally Windows at 42 seconds, just under double the speed difference. There was a single thread and a dual thread test. You could see the performance here is a little bit quicker, but we basically have similar results. In this case, Arch and Ubuntu almost tied up, followed by Fedora, and then Windows at 17 seconds compared to the kind of 8.4 Linux average. Finally, I ran a 7-zip compression test. This is measured in MIPS, so the more the better. And this test didn't have as dramatic of a performance difference we could see on the compression rating. Windows did fall slightly behind. Arch did the best out of everything at about 17,500, with Windows at 17,300. And then the decompression test was a little bit tighter, with again Arch coming in victorious at 12,200. And Windows coming in at about 11,800. Now this very last test doesn't have a Windows component, but since I was running all these, I was kind of interested. How quickly can these operating systems compile the Linux kernel? This was in seconds, so the fewer the better, and in this case, Ubuntu had a clear advantage in kernel compiling at 429 seconds versus Fedora at 522 seconds, and Arch Linux at 561 seconds. So ultimately, what can we actually take from all this data? If we look at all the raw numbers and we don't consider anything else, if you're going to run a server, use Linux. If you want to do any kind of rendering or super heavy tasks, use Linux. If you want to game, you might want to use Windows. But of course, this is incredibly subjective depending on your use cases, and just looking at the numbers really doesn't matter, because let's say Linux can render things slightly faster, but If you need to render things in an Adobe product, well, you're going to have to use Windows anyways. And if you're rendering things, you're probably not going to be using a little machine like this. You're probably going to have a much higher end machine in which the actual performance results become a lot tighter and more irrelevant as the machine gets more powerful. At least that's what we have seen in some of our previous testing. If you're going to build a lower end or low power consuming server for some sort of service, putting Windows on it would frankly be silly. If a machine has to work slightly harder to use whatever software or service you're wanting to run, that can add up pennies by pennies into just being more expensive on your power bill. Now, of course, these are my tests run in my not so scientific environment. The results probably aren't going to be exactly perfect. I did try to keep the variables the same, run all the tests in the same order in similar time frames. I'm curious, leave a comment down below. Do you notice any significant performance differences when you switch operating systems or platforms on the same hardware? That would definitely be interesting to know. And of course, everything I mentioned or everything I talked about in this video is going to be linked down below. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a beautiful day and goodbye.